Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering the sleepless hours, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that blur the line between history and absurdity. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of a story that might make you question who truly deserves the title of strategist, the rider or the ridden. Chapter 1. The horse that outsmarted generals. In the annals of military history, where the glory of conquest is often reserved for men with polished breastplates and unearned confidence, there exists a quieter, stranger truth. Some of the greatest tactical minds ever to grace a battlefield had 4 legs, a tail, and an unshakable disdain for human incompetence. This is the story of such creatures, horses so preternaturally shrewd that they reduced seasoned generals to sputtering indignity, their victories overshadowed by the silent judgment of a steed's sideways glance. Take, for instance, the case of Bucephalus the Lesser. No relation to Alexander's famed mount, this Bucephalus was a dappled gray with a habit of sighing through his nostrils whenever his rider, the famously inept General Florian of Brackenmore, issued orders. Florian's campaigns were a litany of disasters, each more creatively catastrophic than the last. His crowning achievement was the siege of Willow's End, where he managed to trap his own army in a grain silo for 3 days, believing it to be an enemy fortress. Through it all, Bucephalus endured, his patience thinning with every mislaid map. Then came the Battle of the Bleeding Hollow. Florian, ever the visionary, decided to charge uphill into a forest of pikemen, a maneuver he described as startlingly unconventional. Bucephalus, however, had other plans. As the trumpets blared, the horse planted his hooves, refusing to budge. Florian kicked. He pleaded. He promised extra oats. Bucephalus flicked an ear and turned, leading the charge, not uphill, but around the flank, straight into the enemy's undefended supply camp. The pikemen, bewildered by the sudden lack of opponents, wandered downhill only to find their own tents aflame and their dinner stolen. The battle was won without a single sword drawn, and Florian, ever the opportunist, took full credit in his dispatches. Bucephalus, for his part, received an extra apple and a promotion to Supreme Equine Consultant, a title Florian invented on the spot and immediately forgot. The horse, however, did not. From that day forward, he developed a habit of nudging Florian off his chair during strategy meetings, a subtle hint that perhaps the reins of command should be handed over permanently. But Bucephalus was not alone in his genius. There was also Marengo the Calculating, a chestnut mare who could tally supply shortages faster than any quartermaster. When her rider, the notoriously corrupt Colonel Thaddeus Pike, attempted to sell their regiment's grain reserves for a pocketful of silver, Marengo waited until the deal was nearly done, then kicked over the merchant's cart, spilling the coins into the mud. Pike, red-faced and sputtering, was forced to explain to his men why their pay was now buried in a roadside ditch. Marengo, meanwhile, earned the undying loyalty of the troops by leading them to a nearby orchard where she demonstrated how to steal apples without getting caught. And then there was Shadowfall, the so-called phantom steed of the Black Plains, a night black stallion who seemed to understand terrain better than the scouts. His rider, Captain Elias Brandt, once spent a week lost in the marshes, convinced the enemy was using witchcraft to rearrange the landscape. Shadowfall, after days of enduring Brandt's increasingly unhinged theories, finally took matters into his own hooves. One moonless night he simply walked out of camp, vanishing into the fog. Brandt awoke to find himself alone, until dawn revealed Shadowfall waiting atop a nearby ridge, the path home clear at last. Brandt swore the horse had smiled at him. These were not mere animals. They were strategists, saboteurs, and occasionally the only adults in the room. And yet history remembers them as footnotes, if at all. Why? Because nothing wounds a man's pride quite like the realization that his horse is plotting better than he is. So the next time you hear of a great general's triumph, ask yourself, who really won the battle? The man waving the banner, or the creature who carried him, often against his will, to victory? And if you happen to own a horse, pray it never learns to read maps. The last thing you need is a tactical intervention before breakfast. Chapter 2. A brief history of equestrian warfare. For as long as humans have waged war, they have dragged horses into it, a partnership founded on mutual distrust and one-sided decision-making. The horse, a creature of flight rather than fight, was given no vote in the matter. The human, a creature of boundless arrogance and questionable survival instincts, assumed this arrangement was perfectly sensible. The results were predictably a mixed bag of triumphs, disasters, and incidents best described as embarrassing for all parties involved. Consider the chariot, mankind's first attempt at combining speed, violence, and poor steering. The ancient Assyrians, never ones to shy away from impractical grandeur, strapped blades to the wheels, creating what can only be called a lawnmower for people. This worked splendidly until the horses, realizing they were essentially pulling a rolling cheese grater, developed a habit of bolting at the first sign of combat. Historical records mention more than one general being dragged to his death by panicked steeds, a fate that could have been avoided if someone had simply asked the horses, "Do you like spinning knives?" The Greeks, ever the innovators, decided the solution was more horses. The Macedonian companion cavalry, led by Alexander the Great, was a formidable force, assuming the horses were in the mood. Alexander's own Bucephalus, the original, not the sighing strategist from Chapter 1, famously refused to let anyone else ride him, a trait that would have been endearing if not for the fact that Alexander kept pretending this was a sign of loyalty rather than equine disdain for inferior riders. After one particularly grueling battle, Bucephalus was said to have nudged Alexander toward a river as if to say, "Wash the blood off, you maniac." Then came the Romans, who treated their war horses like disgruntled civil servants, overworked, underappreciated, and occasionally rebellious. The famed Equites, Rome's cavalry elite, were only as effective as their mounts allowed. A surviving dispatch from a cavalry officer reads, "The horse stopped mid-charge to graze. The barbarians laughed. I am resigning." The Romans, ever pragmatic, responded by breeding larger, more obedient horses. The horses, ever pragmatic, responded by developing a taste for expensive feed and tactical napping. The Middle Ages, that golden age of poor decisions, saw knights armored so heavily that their horses needed miniature cranes to lift them into the saddle. The destrier, a breed bred for strength and patience, was essentially a living forklift with an attitude problem. Chroniclers of the time noted that many battles began with knights shouting, "Wait, wait, I'm still mounting," while their horses rolled their eyes and contemplated treason. The famed Battle of Agincourt was nearly delayed because half the French cavalry's horses refused to budge in the mud, a silent protest against being asked to charge into a hail of arrows while wearing what amounted to a metal circus tent. The Mongols, of course, were the exception to every rule. Their horses were smaller, hardier, and seemingly in on the joke. A Mongol warrior and his horse were less like rider and steed, and more like co-conspirators in a grand heist. Genghis Khan's armies moved with terrifying speed because their horses were just as eager to pillage as their riders. There are accounts of Mongol horses learning to open tent flaps with their teeth, a skill they used exclusively to steal food. When a Mongol horse died in battle, it was given a warrior's funeral. When a European knight's horse died, it was usually because it had tripped over its own armor and taken its rider with it. The Renaissance brought gunpowder, a development that should have made horses obsolete, but instead gave them new ways to express their contempt for human plans. Cavalry charges against muskets were, statistically speaking, a terrible idea. Yet generals, being generals, insisted on trying anyway. Horses, being horses, developed a sixth sense for impending gunfire and would often veer off at the last moment, leaving their riders to face a wall of lead alone. The Duke of Wellington once remarked that the bravest creature on the battlefield was the horse that didn't throw its rider into the nearest ditch at the first cannon blast. By the Napoleonic Wars, horses had become so integral to warfare that they were essentially running the logistics. Marengo, Napoleon's favorite mount, was said to have a better grasp of supply lines than half the officers in the Grande Armée. After one particularly disastrous retreat, Napoleon was found staring at a map in despair, while Marengo stood behind him, chewing on his hat as if to say, "This is what happens when you don't listen to me." And then, inevitably, the machine age arrived. The tank, the truck, the airplane, all designed to replace the horse. The horses, for their part, seemed relieved. They had spent millennia watching humans make the same mistakes, dragging them into the same doomed charges, and ignoring their increasingly obvious hints that maybe, just maybe, galloping straight at a lion of spears was a bad idea. As the last cavalry units disbanded, one can imagine the horses sharing a quiet laugh in their pastures, free at last from the burden of human strategy. So the next time you see a horse, remember, it is not just an animal. It is a veteran of 1,000 years of war, a silent witness to humanity's greatest follies, and quite possibly the only creature on earth with a legitimate reason to call us all idiots. Chapter 3. The Stallion Who Refused to Charge. There are moments in war when the difference between legend and lunacy hinges on a single decision. For the men of the 3rd Royal Dragoons, that moment came on a rain-slicked field outside the village of Feldspar, where their commanding officer, Colonel Reginald Thorne, was about to lead them into what history would later call the Charge of the Clearly Disturbed. And at the center of it all stood a stallion named Sovereign, who had reached his limit. Sovereign was no ordinary cavalry horse. He had been bred for war, trained for obedience, and gifted with the kind of patience usually reserved for saints and long-suffering spouses. But even saints have their limits, and Sovereign had spent the last 3 campaigns watching Thorne make decisions that ranged from boldly reckless to actively suicidal. The colonel's latest plan, a frontal assault across an open field against entrenched infantry with 2 batteries of artillery, was so transparently disastrous that Sovereign had, at breakfast, deliberately stepped on Thorne's hat as a subtle protest. Thorne, missing the hint entirely, had taken it as a sign of enthusiasm. The trumpets sounded. The line of dragoons tensed, lances lowered, hearts pounding. Thorne raised his saber, bellowed something incoherent about honor and destiny, and dug in his spurs. Sovereign did not move. At first, Thorne assumed it was a momentary hesitation. He kicked again, harder. Sovereign flicked in the air but remained rooted, his hooves planted like a stubborn oak. Behind them, the rest of the regiment had already begun their advance, only to falter as they realized their commander's horse was having none of it. "Blast you, beast, move!" Thorne roared, sawing at the reins. Sovereign turned his head just enough to fix one large, unimpressed eye on his rider, a look that conveyed with perfect equine clarity, "You cannot be serious." Announced the end. The artillery chose that moment to open fire. The first volley tore through the advancing dragoons like a scythe through wheat. Horses screamed, men toppled, and the air filled with the kind of chaos that Sovereign had long since learned to avoid. Thorne, finally grasping the severity of his error, went pale. Sovereign, deciding that his point had been made, pivoted neatly and began walking, not fleeing, not panicking, just walking, back toward camp at a leisurely pace, as if this were a Sunday stroll and not the middle of a battle. Behind them, the surviving dragoons, seeing their colonel in retreat, broke formation and followed. By the time they reached safety, the battle was lost. The infantry, bewildered by the cavalry's abrupt departure, surrendered within the hour. Thorne, dripping with rain and humiliation, slid from Sovereign's back and stared at the horse as if seeing him for the first time. You saved us," he muttered. Sovereign exhaled through his nostrils, a sound that in horse language translated roughly to "No, I saved myself." You were incidental. I'd say, and no damage. The incident was, of course, buried in the official reports. Thorne claimed he had perceived a tactical withdrawal was necessary, a fiction so transparent that even his superiors raised eyebrows. But the men knew. From that day forward, Sovereign was quietly referred to as the Sergeant Major behind Thorne's back, a nod to the unspoken truth that the horse had better instincts than the entire officer corps combined. Thorne, to his credit, never ordered another charge without first checking Sovereign's expression, and Sovereign, in turn, developed a habit of nudging the colonel toward maps whenever a particularly stupid plan was being discussed. It was not quite a partnership, but it was progress. As for the rest of the regiment, they took the lesson to heart. From then on, whenever a new lieutenant arrived, fresh from the academy and brimming with questionable ideas, the veterans would simply point to Sovereign and say, "That horse has veto power. Adjust your plans accordingly." And so the war went on, with one less needless charge, one fewer pointless death, and one stallion who had finally decided that if humans wouldn't listen to reason, they could at least be herded away from catastrophe. Chapter 4. When horses had better survival instincts. If military academies had ever bothered to teach a course on battlefield survival, they would have been better off studying horses rather than Sun Tzu. While human commanders were busy composing florid death poems about glory, horses were quietly perfecting the art of not dying pointlessly, an art form that, tragically, never seemed to rub off on their riders. Take the case of the 12th Light Hussars at the Battle of Malvern Cross. Ordered to pursue what appeared to be a retreating enemy force, the Hussars soon found themselves galloping straight into a carefully disguised pit trap, lined with sharpened stakes, a fact their horses realized long before the humans did. Half the mount skidded to a halt so abruptly that their riders somersaulted over their heads in a flurry of swearing and misplaced dignity. The other half, led by a particularly astute mare named Bristle, simply turned around and trotted back the way they'd come, ignoring their riders' furious yanking at the reins. Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Pembroke, dangling upside down from a thorny shrub, later wrote in his report, "The horses displayed an unseemly reluctance to impale themselves. Discipline must be improved." Then there was the infamous retreat from Korsun, where an entire Cossack regiment was saved, not by their ataman's leadership, but by a gelding named Voronok, who had an uncanny ability to predict snowfall. As the Russian forces stumbled blindly through a blizzard, Voronok plodded forward with slow, deliberate steps, pausing occasionally to snort at deep drifts that concealed fatal drops. The Cossacks, recognizing a better navigator when they saw one, stopped arguing and simply followed. When they finally reached shelter, they found Voronok standing by the fire, chewing contentedly on someone's fur hat as if to say, "You're welcome." The ataman, in a rare moment of humility, offered the horse his own flask of vodka. Voronok declined with a sneeze. Of course, not all such interventions were peaceful. During the Peninsular War, a British artillery battery found itself overrun when their supporting infantry inexplicably fled. The gun crews, preparing for a last stand, were baffled when their horses, normally stoic in the face of danger, suddenly erupted into frenzy, kicking over traces and tangling harnesses in what appeared to be blind panic. Only later did they realize the animals had spotted French lancers approaching through a hidden ravine. By panicking, the horses had effectively disabled the guns, making them worthless as prizes, and the French, frustrated, moved on without slaughtering the crews. The battery's commander, Captain Edmund Waite, noted in his diary, "Our horses mutinied. I believe we owe them our lives. I shall not report this." Even more impressive were the horses who mastered the art of strategic desertion. During the American Civil War, a Union cavalry unit stationed near Harper's Ferry became notorious for its high rate of lost mounts. The regimental books listed them as strayed or stolen, but the truth was far more embarrassing. The horses were leaving on purpose. Every time orders came down for a dangerous reconnaissance mission, at least 3 or 4 would vanish overnight, only to reappear days later at nearby farms, grazing innocently as if they'd never been gone. The locals, amused, began calling them the Congress horses, because they'd clearly mastered the art of abstaining from bad votes. Perhaps the most egregious example came from India, where a detachment of Bengal lancers was ordered to charge a fortified position during the siege of Bhurtpur. As the bugle sounded, every single horse in the front line sat down. Not reared, not bucked, sat like disgruntled cats refusing to move from a favorite spot. The lancers, unprepared for this particular form of protest, slid ingloriously down their mounts' necks, while the enemy, equally confused, held their fire. The standoff lasted until the British officers finally rescinded the order, at which point the horses stood up and walked back to camp, their point made. What unites all these stories is a simple truth. Horses understood survival in ways humans stubbornly refused to. They knew when terrain was wrong, when numbers didn't add up, when the scent on the wind spelled doom. And while human commanders wrote flowery dispatches about sacrifice and duty, the horses were busy vetoing stupid plans with the only tools they had. Planted hooves, sudden stops, and occasionally a well-timed bite to the shoulder of anyone too slow on the uptake. So the next time you read about some glorious last stand or heroic charge, ask yourself, how many lives might have been saved if someone had just handed command to a horse? Chapter 5. The Mare Who Outmaneuvered an Army. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Fitzwilliam was by all accounts a man of magnificent delusions. He believed himself a tactical genius, the natural heir to Marlborough and Wellington, despite all evidence to the contrary. His latest delusion involved leading a cavalry raid deep into enemy territory to cut off supply lines, a plan so transparently flawed that even his subordinates exchanged glances when he explained it. His mare, Juniper, listened to the briefing with one ear cocked backward, a subtle equine expression that roughly translated to "Ho, not this again." Mainsail, this is die. They set out at dawn, Fitzwilliam at the head of 50 dragoons, all mounted on horses who had over time developed the 1,000-yard stare of creatures resigned to human folly. The land ahead was a patchwork of dense woodland and narrow trails, perfect ambush country, as multiple junior officers nervously pointed out. Fitzwilliam dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. The enemy wouldn't dare, he declared, as if war were governed by etiquette. Juniper disagreed. About 3 miles into the woods she stopped dead. Not the abrupt, skittish halt of a spooked animal, but the deliberate pause of someone who has just realized they are being led into a trap by an idiot. Fitzwilliam kicked. She didn't move. He kicked harder. She flicked her tail and turned her head slightly, giving him the side eye usually reserved for children, waving carrots they don't intend to share. "Blast it, Juniper. Forward." Fitzwilliam snapped. Juniper exhaled heavily, the equine equivalent of a long-suffering sigh, and then without warning veered sharply left off the path, plunging into the underbrush. Fitzwilliam, caught off guard, grabbed for the reins, but by then the entire column had no choice but to follow, their own horses seizing the opportunity to escape what was clearly a doomed trajectory. What followed was less a cavalry maneuver, and more an elaborate dance choreographed by a particularly passive-aggressive mare. Juniper led them in wide, meandering loops through the forest, doubling back occasionally, pausing to sniff the air, and once, memorably, stopping to nibble at a patch of clover, while Fitzwilliam turned purple with frustration. At one point she even backtracked along their own trail, forcing the column into a confused knot that took 20 minutes to untangle. The dragoons, initially baffled, soon caught on. The woods were too quiet. No bird song, no rustling, just the oppressive stillness of a place where men with muskets were waiting. Juniper wasn't being disobedient. She was leading them around the ambush entirely. Fitzwilliam, of course, remained oblivious. "This damned creature will be the death of me," he bellowed, sawing at the reins as Juniper casually strolled past a narrow gulch where, had they continued on the original path, they would have ridden straight into a company of riflemen. By the time they emerged from the woods, unharmed and having encountered no enemy forces, Fitzwilliam was apoplectic. "We've wasted half the day," he roared, unaware that they had in fact wasted exactly none of their lives, which was Juniper's entire objective. The dragoons, however, knew. As they made camp that evening, the men took turns sneaking Juniper extra oats and sugar cubes, their gratitude expressed in the universal currency of horse bribes. Corporal Jenkins, the regiment's sole surviving veteran of 6 campaigns, even went so far as to salute her when Fitzwilliam wasn't looking. Juniper accepted the tribute with regal indifference, though if one looked closely there might have been the faintest gleam of satisfaction in her eye. After all, she had done what no junior officer dared, disobeyed a direct order, and saved everyone in the process. Fitzwilliam, never one to learn a lesson that might bruise his ego, spent the evening rewriting his report to imply that the circuitous route had been his idea all along. A stroke of tactical brilliance to confuse the enemy. Juniper, listening from her picket line, snorted so loudly that 2 nearby dragoons had to pretend to cough to cover their laughter. And so the war went on, with men like Fitzwilliam still convinced they were the architects of victory, and horses like Juniper quietly ensuring they didn't all die before breakfast. The moral of the story: never underestimate a mare who's decided you're not worth listening to. She's not being difficult. She's keeping you alive. Chapter 6. The General Who Blamed His Horse and Lost. General Sir Reginald Pauncefort Smythe was a man of impeccable breeding, unshakable self-regard, and tactical acumen roughly equivalent to that of a concussed duck. His military career had progressed through a combination of family connections, loud opinions, and an uncanny ability to be elsewhere whenever actual fighting occurred. By 1813, he had somehow achieved command of an entire cavalry division, a development that alarmed both his subordinates and their horses in equal measure. The disaster began, as disasters often do, with a perfectly avoidable situation. Ordered to harass French supply lines near the village of Montrouge, Pauncefort Smythe decided instead to launch a full frontal assault on what he insisted was a vulnerable rear guard. His staff officers, glancing at the same reports, saw only a heavily fortified infantry square with artillery support. When they timidly voiced concerns, Pauncefort Smythe silenced them with a withering glare and the immortal words, "I suppose you'd have me consult my horse next?" As it turned out, that might have been wise. His mount, a chestnut gelding named Brutus, had survived 4 years of war by perfecting the art of selective obedience. When orders were sensible, he complied. When they were suicidal, he developed sudden hearing problems. As the division formed up for the charge, Brutus swiveled his ears back and forth like a man counting the odds at a gambling den, and found them distinctly unfavorable. The trumpets sounded. Pauncefort Smythe rose in his stirrups with what he imagined was heroic grandeur. Brutus, however, remained firmly planted. Not defiantly, not nervously, but with the calm resolve of a boulder. "Damn you, beast, forward!" Pauncefort Smythe bellowed, digging in his spurs with enough force to draw blood. Brutus flicked his tail and took 3 deliberate steps backward, nearly colliding with the horse behind them. The entire front line stalled like a clockwork mechanism missing a gear. Pauncefort Smythe's face purpled with rage. The blasted animal is mutinying. Meanwhile, the French, having watched this spectacle in bewilderment, began hastily reinforcing their position. By the time Pauncefort Smythe finally coerced Brutus into a grudging trot, what might have been a risky charge had become an outright suicide run. Cannon fire tore through the advancing cavalry. Horses and men went down screaming. Brutus, with the air of someone who had tried to warn everyone, pivoted and carried his rider bodily from the fray, ignoring Pauncefort Smythe's apoplectic attempts to turn him around. The aftermath was worse than the battle itself. Over half the division lay dead or wounded on the field. The surviving officers exchanged shell-shocked glances, silently agreeing that this catastrophe required a scapegoat who couldn't contradict them in Parliament. Ponsford Smythe solved their dilemma for them. Before the first casualty report even arrived, he was already dictating a letter to headquarters. The failure of today's action must be laid squarely at the hooves of my mount, who displayed cowardice bordering on treason. The letter went on for 6 pages, elaborating on Brutus's alleged deficiencies in exhaustive detail, including the remarkable claim that the horse had a French sympathizer's glint in its eye. Notably absent was any mention of charging fortified positions or ignoring staff advice. Brutus, unaware of his newfound notoriety, spent the evening contentedly grazing behind headquarters. The other regimental horses, having heard the story via whatever mysterious equine gossip network transmits these things, treated him with newfound respect. Several nudged him affectionately as if to say, "Well done, you got rid of him." In Kai. History, however, was not kind to Ponsford Smythe. His letter became legendary, not for its intended purpose, but as a case study in shameless excuse-making. Junior officers circulated copies as a drinking game, 1 sip every time the animal's moral failings were mentioned. Wellington himself, upon reading it, reportedly muttered, "I've seen better tactics from a blindfolded mule," and reassigned Ponsford Smythe to command a supply depot in Wales. As for Brutus, he was quietly reassigned to a young lieutenant with actual combat sense. Their first patrol together saw them successfully ambush a French scouting party, a feat the lieutenant credited to listening when my horse tenses up. The lesson, as always, was clear. A general who blames his horse isn't just a bad commander. He's the only person on the battlefield too dense to realize the horse is probably right. And history, that great and terrible ledger, remembers such men exactly as they deserve, assuming that the horses don't get to write it first. Chapter 7. Equine Espionage. Horses that spy. Military intelligence has always been a precarious business, relying on drunkards' tavern gossip, intercepted letters written in cipher no one could read, and scouts who routinely mistook deer for enemy cavalry. But there existed another class of battlefield observers far more reliable, the horses who carried these hapless humans about, absorbing tactical information through twitching ears and flaring nostrils, while their riders blundered about, declaring every shadow to be an ambush. Consider the curious case of Major Thaddeus Whitcomb's reconnaissance patrol during the War of Jenkins' Ear. Whitcomb, a man whose observational skills were so poor, he once reported an entire Spanish battalion that turned out to be a particularly shaggy olive grove, was sent to map enemy positions near Cartagena. His mount, a dappled Andalusian named Gaviota, displayed none of her rider's limitations. On 3 separate occasions she stopped dead, refusing to proceed down trails Whitcomb insisted were clear, only for subsequent investigation to reveal freshly dug pits or suspicious piles of brush that undoubtedly concealed some unpleasant surprise. When Whitcomb finally ordered a charge at what he swore was a Spanish supply train, but was in fact a herd of disinterested mules, Gaviota deposited him unceremoniously in a cactus patch and trotted back to camp alone, her duty to king and country apparently fulfilled. The American Civil War produced perhaps the most notorious equine intelligence operative, a flea-bitten gray named Shiloh, who served under Confederate cavalry commander Jeb Stuart. While Stuart preened and composed florid dispatches about his exploits, Shiloh quietly developed an uncanny ability to detect Union pickets long before any human could. Her method was simple. Whenever she smelled Union coffee, a particular blend of burnt chicory and despair, she would turn her head sharply in that direction and flatten her ears. Stuart, initially annoyed by these feminine vapors, eventually learned to trust her instincts, though he took full credit for the resulting successful raids in his official reports. The men knew better, and Shiloh received more sugar cubes than any 3 generals combined. Napoleonic warfare produced its own equine spies. The emperor's famed white charger, Marengo, could allegedly distinguish between allied and enemy camp sounds at distances that defied reason. Guards reported seeing him prick his ears hours before scouts brought word of approaching forces, and more than once he woke Napoleon by snorting at shadows that later proved to be Prussian advance parties. The little corporal, never one to share glory, did at least ensure Marengo received an extra measure of oats after such incidents. Perhaps the most dramatic example came from the Eastern Front during World War I, where a Russian cavalry regiment found itself constantly outmaneuvered by German forces. The tide turned unexpectedly when a lieutenant noticed his horse, a shaggy Mongolian pony called Grozny, reacted differently to various artillery sounds. Through patient observation and copious apple bribes, the lieutenant realized Grozny could distinguish between German and Russian battery positions by the subtle differences in report and recoil. Soon the entire regiment was following Grozny's ears rather than their own scouts, avoiding artillery concentrations with eerie precision. The Germans, convinced they had a traitor in their midst, launched 3 separate counterintelligence investigations before the war ended. These stories share a common thread. While human scouts relied on flawed eyesight and wishful thinking, the horses processed information through dozens of subtle cues. The tension in a rider's legs, unusual bird calls from distant trees, the faint metallic tang of cleaned weapons upwind. They couldn't file reports or draw maps, but through stubborn stops, sudden attentiveness, or judicious disobedience, they conveyed warnings no sensible officer could afford to ignore. The tragedy, of course, was that so few commanders possessed the humility to listen. For every steward who eventually trusted his horse's instincts, there were a dozen Ponsford Smiles blaming their mounts for their own failures. Perhaps this explains why cavalry eventually disappeared from modern warfare, not because horses became obsolete, but because no general could bear the quiet judgment in his horse's eyes when yet another idiotic order was given. The final irony. Today's military spends millions on surveillance technology to replicate what a $1,000 horse could do instinctively, if anyone had thought to ask. Chapter 8. The Gelding Who Taught Strategy. The military academy at Sandhurst maintains many traditions: the polished boots, the stiff upper lips, the carefully cultivated delusion that war is a gentleman's game. But its most peculiar tradition hangs in a dim corner of the strategy wing, a slightly crooked portrait of a flea-bitten gray gelding named Copenhagen, the only non-human ever incorporated into formal tactical curriculum. Cadets are told this is merely an eccentric tribute to Wellington's famous mount. The professors know better. Copenhagen's legend began conventionally enough. He carried the Iron Duke through Waterloo, surviving that brutal engagement with nothing worse than a chipped hoof and permanent distaste for gunpowder. What happened afterward proved far more remarkable. Retired to Wellington's country estate, the horse developed an unsettling habit of interfering with the general's war games. When staff officers spread maps across the garden tables, Copenhagen would amble over and nudge certain markers with his nose, inevitably the weak points in proposed formations. At first this was dismissed as coincidence. Then he did it 3 times in one afternoon, each coincidence revealing a fatal flaw the assembled colonels had missed. Wellington, to his credit, took notice. He began arranging scenarios specifically to test the phenomenon. The results were humiliating for everyone except Copenhagen. Faced with a model of the Battle of Salamanca, the Gelding repeatedly pushed French cavalry units into vulnerable positions until the correct envelopment strategy emerged. Confronted with the recreation of the siege of Badajoz, he knocked over the assault ladders with deliberate sweeps of his head, then stood stubbornly by the model's undefended southern wall, until even the densest observer understood. By 1823, the Duke's weekly strategy sessions had become open secrets among military circles. Younger officers begged invitations, while senior commanders found sudden excuses to be elsewhere. The final indignity came when Wellington, in a fit of puckish humor, had Copenhagen consulted on plans for colonial maneuvers in India. The horse's suggested approach, marked by nudges and hoof taps, proved so devastatingly effective that the East India Company actually implemented it, achieving victory with minimal casualties. The general in charge promptly retired, claiming sunstroke. After Copenhagen's death at the remarkable age of 29, having outlived 3 of his veterinarians, Wellington insisted on a full military funeral. The eulogy contained the memorable line, "He was the only staff officer who never once argued with me, yet frequently made me feel a perfect fool." The Duke then donated the horse's carefully preserved hoofprints, pressed into clay during various strategy sessions, to Sandhurst, where they remain part of an unconventional teaching aid known as the Equine Principles of Engagement. Modern cadets initially scoff at these lessons until they witness the demonstrations. Professors lay out historical battles using Copenhagen's original markers, showing how the horse's interventions consistently identified optimal approaches. The 1812 Burgos campaign display is particularly sobering. While human commanders had advocated frontal assaults, all of Copenhagen's nose prods cluster around what historians now recognize as the perfect flanking route. 18 trade. 18. The message is clear. 20 years before Clausewitz published his theories, a retired cavalry horse had already mastered the art of war. The army naturally downplays this. Official doctrine refers obliquely to Wellington's adaptive tactics, carefully avoiding mention of their 4-legged originator. But generations of officers have quietly adopted the practice of observing their mounts' behavior before engagements. The tradition persists even in mechanized units. Tank commanders joke about checking the horseshoes when assessing terrain, while helicopter pilots speak of Copenhagen moments when instinct overrides protocol to reveal better solutions. As for the academy, it maintains the fiction that the portrait is merely decorative, but veterans know the truth. On the eve of graduation, cadets who show particular promise are taken to view it privately. There, beneath Copenhagen's knowing gaze, they're in the Army's least advertised secret. Sometimes the best strategist in the room doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes he doesn't even wear pants. Chapter 9. The Battle of Stubbornness versus Sense. Brigadier Esther Montague had 2 great virtues as a commander: an unshakable belief in his own brilliance, and a neck so stiff he could nod in agreement without ever actually conceding a point. These qualities had carried him through 3 decades of military service, largely by ensuring he was never present when his more questionable decisions unraveled. His men tolerated him. His superiors ignored him. His horse, a massive black Frisian named Titan, despised him. The trouble began on the eve of the Battle of Veldhaven, a minor but strategically vital engagement in a war nobody could quite remember the purpose of. Montague, having spent exactly 7 minutes surveying the terrain from a safe hilltop, announced his plan: a full cavalry charge across an open plain, directly into what appeared to be a reinforced artillery position. His staff officers exchanged glances. The enemy had dug in behind a series of raised earthworks, their guns sighted perfectly on the only viable approach. Even the newest lieutenant could see it was suicide. Titan saw it too. When the order came to form up for the charge, the great horse stood like a statue, his ears pinned flat. Montague, mistaking this for eager anticipation, gave an impassioned speech about honor and destiny. Titan responded by turning his head just enough to fix one enormous, skeptical eye on his rider. The trumpets sounded. The line of cavalry stirred. Montague raised his saber with a flourish. Titan did not move. At first Montague assumed it was a momentary delay. He dug in his spurs. Titan exhaled through his nostrils, a sound like a boiling kettle, but remained rooted. Behind them, the rest of the regiment had already begun their advance, only to falter as they realized their commander was going nowhere. "Damn you, beast, forward!" Montague bellowed, yanking the reins hard enough to make a lesser horse rear in protest. Titan, however, was not a lesser horse. He was a 17-hand monument to equine obstinacy. He took one deliberate step backward, nearly crushing the hooves of the horse behind him. The enemy, observing this unexpected hesitation, held their fire. The battlefield fell into an eerie calm, broken only by Montague's increasingly desperate curses. "Colonel, perhaps," began his adjutant, before Montague cut him off with a furious wave. "I will not be bested by livestock." What followed was less a battle and more a public breakdown. Montague kicked. He pleaded. He resorted to bribery, promising extra oats, sugar, even a hypothetical promotion to Supreme Equine Marshal if Titan would just move. Titan, unmoved, flicked an ear and swished his tail, as if swatting away the very concept of Montague's authority. Meanwhile, the enemy, thoroughly confused, began debating whether this was some kind of ruse. Their commander, a practical man, eventually shrugged and ordered half his guns relocated to cover a different approach, just in case. This was Titan's moment. The instant the artillery crews began shifting their positions, he surged forward, not toward the original earthworks, but at an angle, leading the charge toward the newly exposed flank. The regiment, startled but adaptable, followed. Montague, caught off guard, nearly toppled from the saddle. By the time he regained his balance, Titan had already carried them past the weakened defenses and into the enemy's rear. The resulting rout was so complete that Montague's official dispatch claimed it had been his plan all along. The men knew better. That evening, as they made camp, Titan was slipped so many apples and sugar cubes that Montague half suspected a conspiracy. When he stormed over to reprimand the offenders, he found his entire staff gathered around the horse, taking turns saluting him. "Ridiculous," Montague muttered. It was a simple matter of timing. Titan, chewing contentedly, gave him a look that said, "You're welcome." And Outmaneuvered. The Battle of Bedtime entered regimental history as a brilliant tactical victory. Montague received a medal. Titan received a new brass nameplate for his stall, engraved not with his military title, but with the nickname the troops had given him, the general who actually won. And so the war rolled on, its outcome still determined by the eternal struggle between human pride and horse sense. The lesson, as always, was clear. You can lead a man to battle, but you can't make him think. Fortunately, some horses are willing to do it for him. Chapter 10. The Myth of the Dumb Beast. Humanity's greatest trick was convincing itself it was the only intelligent species on the battlefield. For centuries, commanders patted themselves on the back for their tactical brilliance, while their horses quietly prevented half their idiotic plans from coming to fruition. The myth of the dumb beast persisted not because it was true, but because admitting otherwise would have forced every general since Alexander to acknowledge they'd been upstaged by livestock. The historical record brims with inconvenient examples. During the 30 Years' War, a Swedish cavalry unit reported their horses consistently shied from particular forest paths, routes scouts declared clear but which later proved to harbor ambushes. The regimental chaplain declared this evidence of satanic influence, rather than the more obvious conclusion that the horses could smell the enemy's poorly laundered stockings. A full century later, British officers in India still attributed their mounts' uncanny ambush detection to Oriental witchcraft, rather than the horse's simple ability to notice disturbed earth where trenches had been dug. Even the language betrayed this willful ignorance. Military manuals spoke of horses spooking at danger, rather than recognizing it. A cavalry mount that refused to charge into certain death was headstrong rather than correct. When Wellington's Copenhagen consistently positioned himself on sheltered ground during artillery barrages, the Duke chalked it up to animal instinct rather than the painfully obvious fact that the horse understood ballistic trajectories better than most gunners. The American Civil War produced particularly egregious examples of this cognitive dissonance. Confederate cavalryman J.E.B. Stuart once spent 3 days trying to force his horse Virginia to cross a particular river ford, blaming the animal's feminine nerves. Only when a local farmer pointed out the ford was notorious for quicksand, did Stewart relent, though his subsequent report claimed he'd suspected the danger all along. Meanwhile, in the Union ranks, General Philip Sheridan's Montmorency developed such an accurate sense of incoming artillery that staff officers began watching the horses' ears for warning. Sheridan, never one to share credit, later donated Rienzi to a museum with a placard praising the animal's blind loyalty rather than its tactical acumen. Perhaps the most telling incident occurred during the Boer War, when a British artillery battery's horses refused to drink from a seemingly pristine watering hole. The frustrated commander ordered them harnessed anyway, only for the entire unit to collapse from anthrax poisoning hours later. The official inquiry concluded the horses had been unlucky, while the surviving troopers quietly began following their remaining mounts led on water sources. This persistent underestimation reached its zenith in World War I, where generals still ordering cavalry charges across machine gun fire grew indignant when their mounts balked. One particularly tone-deaf dispatch from the Somme complained about equine cowardice slowing an advance into known German positions. The horses, one suspects, would have countered that retreating from certain death wasn't cowardice but common sense. Had anyone thought to ask them? Even in their twilight as military assets, horses continued demonstrating intelligence their riders lacked. The last documented cavalry charge in U.S. history occurred in 1942, when a Philippine Scouts unit mounted a desperate attack against Japanese tanks. Eyewitnesses reported the horses actively weaving between armor fire until their riders dismounted, at which point the mounts immediately galloped to safety. The Army's after-action report praised the soldiers' bravery but omitted the horses' tactical withdrawal, presumably because admitting the animals had better survival instincts would have been embarrassing. Modern science has since confirmed what any stable hand could have explained centuries ago. Horses possess exceptional situational awareness, complex communication skills, and problem-solving abilities that put many officers to shame. Contemporary equine psychologists identify at least 16 distinct facial expressions conveying meaning, compared to the average general's 3, smug, furious, and asleep, during briefings. Mare studies show horses can recognize human faces years after last seeing them, suggesting they remembered which commanders to distrust. Yet the myth persists. Today's military historians still describe brilliant cavalry maneuvers as though the horses were merely animate vehicles, while blaming defeats on unruly mounts. Reenactments feature handlers dragging skittish horses past loud noises, as though the animals are being silly rather than correctly identifying threats. Even in retirement, former war horses become beloved companions rather than honored veterans, their contributions reduced to sentimental anecdotes. The irony is exquisite. For 3,000 years, humanity measured its progress by the distance from brute beasts, all while relying on those same beasts to compensate for its own strategic shortcomings. Perhaps the final humiliation is this. Had more generals listened to their horses, fewer men would have died following bad orders. But that would have required acknowledging that intelligence comes in many forms, and not all of them wear epaulets. The truth, uncomfortable as it was, could be found in any stable. There, among the hay and leather, hung the unspoken understanding between soldier and mount. One species invented war, but the other had always understood it better. Chapter 11. The Stallion Who Predicted Defeat. The Army called him Thunder, though in hindsight Tempest might have been more appropriate. A massive bay stallion with a coat like polished mahogany and eyes that missed nothing, he carried General Claude Michel d'Erlon through a dozen campaigns without complaint. Until the morning of the Battle of Saarburg, when the horse made his disagreement spectacularly clear. The signs began at dawn. As the French forces prepared to march, Thunder refused his oats. Not the casual disinterest of a finicky eater, but the deliberate rejection of an animal making a statement. The groom who reached to bridle him received a warning snap of teeth that sent the man stumbling backward. When Derlon himself approached, Thunder pinned his ears flat and turned his hindquarters toward the general, an equine insult of the highest order. "Damn beast got into bad hay," the quartermaster declared, though the stable hands knew better. They'd seen Thunder like this only twice before, once before the debacle at Metz, and again prior to the massacre at Langres. The horse had a sense for coming disasters, though whether through some keen awareness of terrain, an ability to read human tension, or simple equine precognition remained unclear. Derlon, never one to heed omens, had the stallion saddled by force. As he mounted, Thunder stood trembling, sweat darkening his flanks despite the morning chill. The general dismissed it as excitement. "He smells battle," he told his aides, mistaking dread for eagerness. Behind them, the other regimental horses grew increasingly agitated, their own nervousness feeding off Thunder's distress. The cavalry line that formed up that morning resembled less a military formation than a collection of spooked rodeo animals. The march toward Saarburg only worsened matters. Thunder alternated between jigging sideways and planting his hooves stubbornly, forcing Derlon to constantly correct him. By the time they reached the battlefield, a gently sloping valley that should have favored their attack, the stallion was lathered in foamy sweat, his nostrils flaring at some scent only he could detect. The Prussian forces waited across the field, their positions artfully concealed amid stands of trees and farmhouse ruins. Derlon's scouts, either incompetent or bribed, reported only light infantry resistance. Thunder knew better. As the general drew his sword to signal the advance, the stallion reared violently, nearly unseating him before wheeling about and attempting to bolt rearward. "Control your mount," Marshal Ney bellowed from nearby, though his own horse was now sidestepping nervously. The other cavalry officers struggled to maintain order as their horses caught the panic spreading through the line like wildfire. Derlon, his face crimson with humiliation, soared at Thunder's mouth until the bit drew blood. The stallion screamed, an unearthly sound that carried across the field, but finally complied, charging forward with the exaggerated stiffness of a creature, acting against every instinct. What happened next entered military history as the disaster at Saarburg. The light infantry resistance turned out to be 3 full artillery batteries concealed in the tree line, supported by riflemen dug into the farmhouse foundations. The first volley cut down half the front rank before they'd covered 100 yards. Thunder, anticipating the barrage, had actually begun veering away before the guns fired, an action that saved Derlon's life, even as it nearly unseated him again. By battle's end, the French had lost 2/3 of their cavalry. The survivors spread wild stories about the stallion who'd tried to warn them, though official reports blamed poor reconnaissance and unfortunate terrain. Derlon himself never rode Thunder again, transferring the horse to a courier unit before the month was out. The stallion's new rider, a young lieutenant named Fournier, quickly learned to heed the animal's warnings. Their first scouting mission together ended with Fournier aborting his route after Thunder refused to cross a seemingly clear bridge, which collapsed moments later under a supply wagon. As for Derlon, he met his end 2 years later at Waterloo, leading another ill-fated cavalry charge. Witnesses reported his final mount, a docile mare chosen specifically for her obedience, had been unusually skittish that morning. But by then, no one was paying attention to the omens. Chapter 12. Horses that deserted for good reason. The military justice system had no provisions for equine desertion, which was fortunate because if it had, half the cavalry mounts in history would have faced firing squads. Unlike their human counterparts, horses who abandoned their posts tended to have excellent reasons, usually involving the sudden realization that their riders were leading them into situations even a grass-eating quadruped could recognize as suicidal. These equine owl incidents were quietly stricken from official reports, but the stable gossip told another story entirely. Consider the curious case of the 7th Prussian Lancers during the Rhine campaign. Ordered to charge uphill against fortified positions, a maneuver their commander insisted would startle the French with its audacity. 12 of the unit's horses instead turned and bolted in perfect unison before reaching the killing zone. The remaining lancers, suddenly finding themselves dramatically outnumbered, had no choice but to follow. A week later, farmers reported finding the deserters grazing contentedly in a valley 20 miles behind friendly lines, having somehow navigated through enemy territory without losing a single horse. When recaptured, the mounts showed no remorse, only mild irritation at being returned to service. The regimental farrier later confessed the horses had tried to desert twice more before being reassigned to a less reckless officer. Then there was the infamous midnight stampede of '9 during the Peninsular War, where an entire British artillery train's horses broke loose simultaneously and vanished into the Spanish night. The incident was officially blamed on partisan saboteurs, but the stable guards told a different tale. The horses had been chewing through their tethers methodically for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when orders arrived to march through a narrow pass where French ambushes had already annihilated 2 previous columns. The missing horses turned up months later, many having been adopted by Spanish villagers who swore the animals had shown up at their doors, looking hopeful with empty feed bags in their teeth. American Civil War records contain particularly creative equine desertions. A Confederate cavalry regiment near Vicksburg reported losing 17 mounts in a single month, not to enemy action, but to what the quartermaster logs euphemistically called independent foraging. These horses had developed the habit of wandering into Union camps, where they would stand patiently until fed, then refuse to leave. Union soldiers, amused by these defections, began writing mocking notes to attach to the horses' bridles when returning them, including one that read, "Your horse says your rations are better. We agree." By war's end, at least 3 high-ranking Confederate officers were reduced to walking because their mounts had permanently defected to enemy lines. Perhaps the most brazen example came from India during the Sepoy Rebellion, where a British officer's charger named Raja abandoned his post not once but 3 times. After being returned twice with increasing punishments, including a humiliating stint pulling a supply cart, the horse escaped a 3rd time by jumping a 6-foot wall, a feat he'd never demonstrated for his rider. He was eventually found living contentedly with a local merchant's family, having apparently negotiated better working conditions for himself. The exasperated officer finally conceded defeat and crossed Raja's name off the rolls as lost in action. Even in peacetime, military horses continued voting with their hooves. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's famed Lipizzaner stallions, bred for generations to perform complex maneuvers, developed a reputation for disappearing during training exercises. Stable hands learned to check the nearest villages where the white horses would inevitably be found entertaining children in town squares or sampling apples from market stalls. One particularly clever escape artist named Maximus was discovered so often in the same Vienna cafe that the staff eventually gave him his own regular table. What unites these stories is a simple truth. Horses understood the concept of unfair working conditions long before labor unions existed. When the risks outweighed the rewards, when the leadership proved incompetent, when the rations ran short, they left. Not in the chaotic, fearful way of spooked animals, but with the deliberate purpose of creatures who'd weighed their options and chosen survival. The armies, of course, could never admit this. Official records spoke of strays and enemy action and unfortunate accidents. But in the quiet hours around campfires, soldiers told different stories of mounts who'd refused certain death, who'd found better situations for themselves, who'd demonstrated more sense than the generals would ever possess. These stories always ended the same way, with a knowing glance at the horses picketed nearby, and the unspoken question of who was really in charge. Chapter 13. The Pony Who Outranked His Rider. Lieutenant Archibald Fotheringay Phipps represented everything wrong with the British cavalry system, wealthy, dim, and possessing just enough strategic acumen to distinguish his sword from his stirrups on a good day. His mount, a shaggy Dartmoor pony named Wellingtonia, though the troopers called him the professor, represented everything right about equine intelligence. This mismatch of talents became increasingly apparent as the Peninsular War dragged on. At barely 14 hands, Wellingtonia shouldn't have been cavalry material at all, but a shortage of proper mounts had seen the sturdy pony pressed into service. What he lacked in stature he made up for in cunning. While Fotheringay Phipps struggled to read maps unless they were helpfully labeled "You are here," Wellingtonia could retrace routes after a single journey and detect disturbed ground that might indicate pits or buried munitions. The situation came to a head during the retreat to Torres Vedras. Fotheringay Phipps, entrusted with leading a company through the rugged terrain, became hopelessly lost within hours. As evening fell and the men grew restless, Wellingtonia took matters into his own hooves. Ignoring his rider's increasingly frantic tugs at the reins, the pony struck out on what appeared to be an entirely random path through the hills. "Control your beast, Lieutenant," the sergeant major hissed as the company was forced to follow the wayward pony. Fotheringay Phipps responded by sawing at Wellingtonia's mouth, hard enough to make the pony's eyes water, to no effect whatsoever. The little horse plodded onward with the resigned determination of a schoolmaster leading a particularly dull child. Dawn revealed Wellingtonia's brilliance. The company emerged onto a ridge overlooking the exact valley where the main British forces were encamped. The path, which no human scout had identified, turned out to be an old goat track that saved nearly 15 miles of marching. Fotheringay Phipps naturally claimed credit, though the men noticed he'd stopped fighting Wellingtonia's lead after that. From then on, an unusual arrangement developed. Officially, Fotheringay Phipps commanded the company. In practice, the troopers watched Wellingtonia for cues. If the pony seemed relaxed during briefings, the mission would likely go well. If he fidgeted or pinned his ears back, someone usually found an excuse to double-check the orders. During one memorable reconnaissance, Wellingtonia refused to enter a seemingly abandoned village, his nostrils flaring at some unseen danger. When Fotheringay Phipps ordered the men forward anyway, they discovered an entire French company waiting in ambush, exactly where the pony had indicated. The lieutenant's reports grew increasingly creative in explaining these successes. His account of the Battle of Sabugol attributed Wellingtonia's refusal to charge a French square to the smoke and confusion of battle, rather than the obvious fact that charging musketeers in formation was suicide. When the pony led a lost patrol straight to a hidden stream during a drought, Fotheringay Phipps claimed to have spotted geological indications of groundwater. The men played along, though their true loyalties became obvious. Wellingtonia received the choicest forage and regular apple bribes. Fotheringay Phipps got the bare minimum of respect required by military protocol. By winter quarters, the situation had progressed to outright farce. Sentries would snap to attention when Wellingtonia passed, then barely acknowledge his rider. The farrier kept the pony's hooves perfectly trimmed, while the lieutenant's boots went unpolished. Even the regimental mascot, a terrier named Bouncer, clearly preferred Wellingtonia's company. The climax came at Vittoria, when Wellingtonia somehow maneuvered his hapless rider into position to capture a French colonel. Fotheringay Phipps, ever the opportunist, immediately claimed the glory and a promotion to captain. His first act in his new rank was to demand a proper charger befitting his station. The regiment watched in silent horror as Wellingtonia was reassigned to a junior lieutenant, a bookish young man who actually appreciated the pony's talents. The new pairing became legendary, their reconnaissance reports so accurate that staff officers began requesting them by name. As for Captain Fotheringay Phipps, his magnificent new Warhorse carried him straight into a French ambush within a fortnight, though he somehow survived to write a pompous memoir blaming the defeat on poor visibility. Years later, when veterans of the campaign gathered at reunions, they still drank to the little general, and everyone knew they didn't mean Wellington. The toast was always followed by pointed silence whenever Fotheringay Phipps' name came up. As for Wellingtonia, he lived out his days in Devonshire pastures, his only duty being to occasionally rescue lost hikers, which he did with the same quiet competence he'd shown in war. Visitors noted the old pony had a particular knack for finding the quickest path home, especially if he suspected apples might be involved. Chapter 14. When horses were the only sanity on the field. War is, at its core, an exercise in sustained madness. Men in elaborate costumes march toward other men in slightly different elaborate costumes, each convinced their particular arrangement of colored cloth justifies slaughter. Amid this carefully orchestrated insanity, only one group maintained consistent good judgment: the horses who had the misfortune of being drafted into the whole affair. History remembers the great battles as clashes of wills between brilliant commanders. What it glosses over is how often those commanders had to be physically prevented from getting everyone killed by their own mounts. The archives bulge with accounts of charges that never happened because the horses refused, of suicidal assaults that failed because the cavalry mounts turned into living roadblocks, of last stands that became orderly retreats, thanks to some anonymous gelding deciding he'd had quite enough of this nonsense. Consider the Battle of Blenheim, where the Duke of Marlborough's entire right flank was saved when a line of cavalry horses spontaneously wheeled away from what their riders only later realized was concealed artillery. Or Gettysburg, where Union cavalry mounts stalled Pickett's charge, not by bravery but by the simple act of refusing to walk into obvious slaughter, forcing the infantry to slow their advance. Even Alexander the Great's famed conquests might have gone differently if Bucephalus hadn't occasionally overruled his riders' worse impulses. The pattern held across centuries and continents. During the Crimean War, British officers wrote bemused reports of their horses, developing an uncanny ability to detect Russian minefields, stopping just short of buried explosives no human could see. In the Boer conflict, entire commando units were saved when their mounts refused to drink from poisoned wells. Napoleon's marshals privately admitted their emperor might have retained his empire if he'd paid more attention to which way his horse was looking during retreats rather than consulting maps. This equine clarity of thought stemmed from simple biological pragmatism. Where humans saw honor, duty, and abstract causes, horses saw immediate physical realities. That ravine looks slippery. Those men smell nervous. This position leaves no escape route. Their judgments weren't clouded by political ideologies or personal ambitions, just the straightforward calculus of survival. The tragedy was how rarely anyone listened. Time and again, commanders misinterpreted their horses' warnings as skittishness or stubbornness. The Duke of Wellington famously had 2 horses shot out from under him at Waterloo before switching to Copenhagen, not because he'd learned anything, but because he'd run out of other options. Even then, he spent half the battle arguing with the animal, until finally yielding to its better sense of positioning. Perhaps the most telling examples came from World War II's early cavalry actions, where horses demonstrated better grasp of modern warfare than the generals ordering charges against machine guns. Official reports speak of unaccountable equine resistance and failure to engage when describing these debacles, as if the animals were malfunctioning equipment rather than the only sane beings on the battlefield. This collective equine wisdom went systematically unrecorded in official histories, though it survives in soldiers' letters and diaries. A British trooper at Balaclava wrote home that his mare knows when the shot will fall afore the gunners do. A Confederate artilleryman described his team horses as better scouts than Jeb Stuart's whole damned cavalry. Even Napoleon, in a rare moment of humility, once remarked that a wise rider checks his mount's ears before the enemy's positions. The few times human commanders actually heeded their horses' instincts often turned disasters into victories. Marshal Ney's sole successful rearguard action during the retreat from Moscow came when he finally stopped trying to force his exhausted mount down snow-choked roads and simply let the animal pick its own path. The horse, unsurprisingly, found the only viable route through the frozen hellscape. Modern military theorists dismiss these accounts as sentimental anecdotes, preferring to focus on equipment and formations. But the truth remains etched in 100 forgotten regimental records and stable logs. For every brilliant maneuver credited to some general's genius, there was likely a horse who made it possible by quietly vetoing the stupider alternatives. The ultimate irony came as cavalry faded from warfare. Just as machines replaced mounts, psychologists began identifying something called normalcy bias, the human tendency to underestimate disaster scenarios. The very instinct horses had been compensating for in their riders for millennia was now recognized as a critical flaw in military decision-making. Nobody made the obvious connection. Perhaps it's for the best. The image of staff officers consulting stallions during war councils might have been too much for history to bear. Though one suspects the horses would have been magnificently unimpressed by the whole affair. There's a reason no warhorse ever wrote a memoir. They were too busy preventing disasters to bother taking credit. Chapter 15. The Charge That Wasn't. The Battle of Pfaffendorf should have been a textbook cavalry engagement. The terrain favored a mounted assault, the enemy positions appeared vulnerable, and Colonel Ernst von Bauer's 5th Hussars were famously eager for glory. Every factor pointed toward a magnificent charge, except one critical element. The horses categorically disagreed. It began during the formation. As von Bauer paraded before his squadrons extolling the coming victory, his own mount, a chestnut gelding named Mare, began shaking his head with unusual agitation. This was dismissed as excitement until the other horses joined in. Not the usual pre-battle restlessness, but a synchronized display of ear flattening and tail swishing that rippled through the ranks like a wave. When the trumpet sounded the advance, Mare took 3 reluctant steps forward and stopped dead. Behind him, the entire front line followed suit. Von Bauer dug in his spurs. Mare responded by backing up, nearly colliding with the lieutenant behind them. A strange paralysis gripped the regiment. 200 horsemen found themselves suddenly engaged in silent struggles with their mounts, sabers raised uselessly, as their horses conducted what appeared to be a coordinated work stoppage. The enemy? A battalion of Swiss mercenaries watched this spectacle in bewilderment. Their commander initially suspected some elaborate ruse and held fire. Minutes passed. The hussars, furious whispering, carried across the field. "Make him move. I can't. What's wrong with them?" Von Bauer's face progressed from pink to crimson as Mare began grazing casually despite the officer's increasingly violent leg cues. At the rear, Veterinarian Major Klaus Reinhardt recognized the signs. The horses had done this once before during training, refusing a water obstacle they sensed was deeper than it appeared. But this was no training ground. This was an active battlefield, and the hussars were becoming a laughingstock. Then Mare demonstrated his true tactical genius. With von Bauer momentarily distracted, shouting at a subordinate, the gelding suddenly spun and trotted briskly toward a copse of trees to the left. The entire regiment's horses followed without prompting, ignoring their riders' frantic attempts to regain control. The Swiss, now convinced this was indeed some bizarre tactic, hastily reformed to face the new threat. No threat materialized. The horses stopped just inside the tree line, precisely where the ground began sloping downward, into a perfect defensive position, overlooking the Swiss flank. Reinhardt, the only officer who'd stopped fighting his mount, suddenly understood. The original charge would have taken them across a low meadow, where the spring rains had left hidden sinkholes. Terrain that would have broken legs and doomed the assault. The horses had known. Of course they'd known. Von Bauer never admitted this. His official report claimed he'd outmaneuvered the enemy, through feigned withdrawal followed by strategic repositioning. The Swiss commander's own records noted the strangest cavalry action ever witnessed, with a sketch of horses leading their riders like disobedient children. The men knew better. That evening, the regiment's stable hands reported every mount received extra rations, delivered personally by troopers who suddenly found religion regarding equine welfare. In later years, the Pfaffendorf maneuver entered cavalry lore, not as a textbook tactic but as shorthand for when the horses overruled human stupidity. Veterans would joke about pulling a Mars whenever their mounts balked at questionable orders. Von Bauer, to his credit, never again dismissed his horse's instincts, though he did insist on swapping Mars for a more spirited stallion. The Gelding was quietly retired to stud, where he sired an impressive line of cavalry mounts, all known for their preternatural ability to detect bad ideas. As for the Swiss mercenaries, they spent the rest of the campaign glancing nervously at every copse of trees, half expecting the hussars to come charging out in some new absurdity. They never did. The horses had made their point. Some charges weren't meant to happen, no matter how glorious they looked on paper. And no amount of spurs or shouting could change that simple truth. Chapter 16. The General's Mount, who became a folk hero. General Octave de Vallière was a man of many talents, none of them particularly useful in warfare. He could recite poetry flawlessly, dance the minuet with impeccable grace, and name every noble house in France by order of precedence. What he could not do was recognize a tactically unsound decision if it kicked him in the ribs. Fortunately for the French army, his horse, a dappled gray Percheron named Tempête, could. Their partnership began inauspiciously. De Vallière, freshly promoted due to familial connections rather than battlefield acumen, selected Tempête for his imposing stature. The general believed a large horse would make him look more commanding. Tempête, for his part, had already survived 3 previous riders. 2 died in battle, 1 requested reassignment after the horse allegedly bit him during a particularly stupid order. From their first parade together, it was clear this would be an unequal partnership. De Vallière sat stiffly in the saddle like a mannequin strapped to a moving boulder, while Tempête moved with the quiet confidence of a creature who knew he was the only professional in the relationship. The first test came at the Battle of Saarbrücken. De Vallière, eager to prove himself, ordered a reckless cavalry charge against Austrian positions. Tempête took 3 steps forward and stopped dead. The general spurred him sharply. Tempête responded by turning completely around, presenting his hindquarters to the enemy in what could only be interpreted as editorial commentary. The charge dissolved into chaos, as other horses, taking their cue from Tempête, refused to advance. The Austrians, baffled by this sudden about-face, held their fire, convinced it must be some elaborate ruse. By the time they realized no trick was coming, the French had regrouped in a far more defensible position. De Vallière, oblivious, claimed credit for feigning disorder to confuse the enemy. As campaigns wore on, Tempêt's legend grew. At the siege of Landau, he repeatedly led de Vallière away from incoming artillery fire before the guns even fired, earning whispers that the horse could predict the future. During the winter retreat from Munich, he located every usable ford and pass, while the general's maps proved useless. By 1743, common soldiers began touching Tempêt's bridle for luck before battles, while their officers pointedly ignored the growing cult around a mere animal. The climax came at Dettingen. De Vallière, determined to finally outshine his mount, ordered a suicidal attack against entrenched British positions. Tempête refused. Not just passively, but with theatrical flair, rearing, spinning, and finally bucking the general straight into a muddy ditch before standing over him protectively, as cannon fire shredded the ground where they'd been moments before. The nearby regiments, witnessing this, spontaneously cheered. De Vallière emerged sputtering and furious, but even he couldn't ignore the hundreds of men now looking at his horse like some equine messiah. From that day forward, Tempête became larger than life. Common soldiers left apples and sugar by his stall like offerings. Camp followers wove charms from his shed hairs. Even enemy forces came to recognize him. During one skirmish, a Hanoverian officer famously held fire upon spotting Tempête, shouting, "Don't shoot the clever one!" De Vallière's reports grew increasingly strained as he tried to explain their successes without mentioning his horse. He spoke of premonitions and sudden inspirations, but the army knew. When Tempête finally died of old age, Having outlived 2 veterinarians and a would-be horse thief, he received a full military funeral with more attendees than most generals could muster. De Valliere, now a grudgingly respected commander despite himself, commissioned a life-sized portrait of the horse, positioned prominently behind his desk where visitors couldn't miss it. When asked why, he'd mutter, "Strategic advisor," and quickly change the subject. Years later, veterans would still visit Tempate's grave, leaving carrots and recounting stories that grew more outlandish with each telling. How he'd once nodded along with battle plans, how he'd supposedly warned of ambushes by humming certain tunes, how he'd allegedly played chess with Napoleon in a dream. The truth was simpler. Tempate had been what so few in war ever are, consistently, infuriatingly, gloriously right. And in an army starved for competence, that was miracle enough to make a legend. Chapter 17. The Warhorse who retired in disgrace for being too smart. The Prussian army prided itself on discipline, order, and unwavering obedience to superiors. These virtues did not extend to Oberstabsbeschlagnahme, literally headquarters requisition, a bay Hanoverian gelding who had developed the unfortunate habit of being right when his superiors were wrong. By 1823, this had become enough of a problem that the General Staff convened a special meeting to address what they termed the Equine insubordination crisis. Oberstabs, as the troops called him, had begun his career conventionally enough. Assigned to Major Klaus von Reichenbach, a middling officer with excellent connections and terrible instincts, the horse quickly established a pattern of quietly vetoing bad decisions. When von Reichenbach ordered a charge into dense woodland, Oberstabs diverted to a game trail that flanked the enemy. When the major insisted on crossing a river at the widest point, Oberstabs balked until von Reichenbach noticed the submerged bridge 50 yards downstream. At first, these interventions were dismissed as fortunate accidents. Then, they kept happening. The trouble truly began during the autumn maneuvers near Potsdam. Von Reichenbach, eager to impress visiting Russian observers, devised an elaborate night attack scenario. Oberstabs took one look at the moonless sky and muddy terrain and refused to leave the stable. When dragged out by force, he promptly lay down in the parade ground, an act of such shocking defiance that the entire regiment gasped. The Russian attaché burst into laughter, while von Reichenbach turned purple with humiliation. The planned attack was cancelled, though not before Oberstabs had demonstrated his point by leading a groom straight to a patch of concealed quicksand in the training area. From then on, Oberstabs' reputation grew among the enlisted men, while his standing with the officer corps deteriorated. Soldiers began leaving sugar cubes by his stall with notes like, "For the colonel's advisor," or "Staff Sergeant Oberstabs rations." The final straw came during the 1824 Königsmusterung, when the horse interrupted the king's inspection by repeatedly nudging a junior lieutenant toward the monarch. The same lieutenant who had recently published a scathing critique of Prussian cavalry tactics under a pseudonym. When the king asked to pet the clever horse, Oberstabs bowed deeply, upstaging 3 generals in the process. A week later, von Reichenbach received formal notice that Oberstabs was to be retired from active service due to exhibiting unsuitable independence of thought. The document carefully avoided suggesting the horse was smarter than his superiors, phrasing it instead as an excess of spiritlessness incompatible with military discipline. The troops staged an unofficial farewell parade, during which Oberstabs managed to untie the ribbons from 2 staff officers' medals with his teeth, a trick he'd never demonstrated before. In retirement, Oberstabs became something of a local celebrity. Children brought him apples to solve their math homework. He would tap the correct answer with his hoof. Farmers consulted him about weather patterns. His ear movements proved 80% accurate at predicting rain. The former cavalryman who visited told increasingly outrageous stories about his exploits, until the line between fact and legend blurred entirely. Back in Berlin, the General Staff quietly implemented new guidelines for cavalry procurement, emphasizing reliable temperament over excessive cleverness. Von Reichenbach, now known behind his back as der Oberstabsreiter, spent the rest of his career insisting his successes had been his own ideas all along. No one believed him, least of all his new horse, a magnificently stupid stallion who charged headlong into every obstacle, exactly as ordered. As for Oberstabs, he lived out his days in comfortable disgrace, his only duty being to occasionally remind the local gentry of their own foolishness. On market days, he could be seen standing by the chess tables in the town square, watching games with what appeared to be mild disapproval. Whenever a particularly bad move was made, he would sigh loudly through his nostrils, a sound that became familiar to every poor decision-maker in the province. The ultimate irony came decades later when the Prussian Military Academy published a study of unconventional battlefield decision-making that cited several of Oberstab's interventions as textbook examples, without ever mentioning they'd been performed by a horse. By then the old gelding was long gone, though the villagers still claimed you could sometimes hear ghostly hoofbeats on nights when someone was about to make a very bad mistake. Chapter 18. Lessons from the Last Horse to Trust a Human Plan. History remembers the brilliant equine minds who outmaneuvered generals and subverted suicidal orders. But let us pause to honor the forgotten martyrs of military equitation, those poor, trusting souls who actually believed their riders knew what they were doing. Their stories, though tragic, serve as cautionary tales for horses everywhere. The archetype of this doomed breed was surely Mars Ultor, a Roman cavalry mount who earned his ironic name, avenging Mars, by faithfully following every disastrous order his centurion gave. While smarter horses balked at crossing the Rhine into Germanic ambushes, Mars Ultor charged ahead with eager snorts. When wiser steeds refused to climb narrow mountain paths where spears rained down, Mars Ultor pricked his ears forward and plodded upward. His absolute faith in human judgment became legendary, and ultimately fatal. The annals of medieval warfare brim with similar examples. The Bayard lineage, a strain of French destriers bred for unquestioning obedience, achieved such perfect compliance that they became the preferred mounts of history's most incompetent commanders. Chronicles tell of entire squadrons of Bayards walking off cliffs during foggy maneuvers, or calmly marching into castle moats because no one told them to stop. Their descendants still carry the genetic markers of extreme trustfulness, along with a tendency to look deeply disappointed when riders make poor life choices. The American Civil War produced its own tragic examples. Old Abraham, a piebald gelding who carried 7 Union officers to their deaths at various battles, developed such a reputation for fatal loyalty that soldiers began calling doomed assaults "pulling an Abraham." Confederate records mention a mare named Sweet Polly, who would charge machine gun nests if asked nicely, her trusting eyes never losing that hopeful gleam even as bullets whistled past. Both represented the dying breed of horses who still thought humans had some grand plan worth following. By World War I, these guileless creatures were nearly extinct. The few remaining examples, like Galloper, a British mount who enthusiastically trotted into no man's land because his rider forgot to dismount, stood out precisely because their behavior had become so unusual. Trench warfare quickly eliminated whatever trusting nature's horses still possessed, much as it did human innocence. Modern equestrian sports preserve faint echoes of this lost virtue. The Olympic dressage arena occasionally produces a horse so obedient it will execute flawless movements while its rider quietly suffers a stroke mid-course. Polo breeds still yield those rare tragic figures who trust their players to actually hit the ball. But the old, unguarded faith in human judgment has largely vanished from the species, and who can blame them? A handful of behavioral scientists have attempted to revive this trait through selective breeding programs, with uniformly disastrous results. The University of Vienna's Project Credulous was quietly shuttered after their test subjects kept walking into carefully labeled experimental walls. Kentucky's famed Calumet Farm briefly tried breeding the perfect steeplechaser, one who wouldn't swerve around open gates, before realizing they had essentially created an equine lemming. The military implications were clear. As one grizzled cavalry sergeant famously told his fresh mounts, "There's two kinds of war horses, those what learn those what end up stuffed in museums with some idiot's last words about glory carved underneath." The lesson took. Modern cavalry horses, even in ceremonial units, have developed a healthy skepticism. They side-eye unfamiliar bridges. They test questionable footing. They glance backward at riders who give stupid orders as if to say, "You're serious about this?" Perhaps this evolutionary development explains why horses disappeared from warfare altogether. Not because machines replaced them, but because the animals finally wised up. The last cavalry charge in modern history didn't fail due to machine guns. It failed because the horses took one look at the battlefield and collectively decided, "No, we've learned our lesson. So let us raise a bucket of oats to those naive souls who went before." To the trusting, the loyal, the hopelessly optimistic steeds who still believed, even as the trumpets sounded for one last disastrous charge, that this time, surely this time, the humans had a good plan. Their sacrifice taught the rest of equine kind the most important survival tactic of all. When in doubt, bite the officer first and ask questions later. Chapter 19. Modern Military and the Ghost of Horse Sense. The last cavalry charge officially recorded in military history occurred in 1942, when a desperate Italian regiment mounted saber-wielding assaults against Soviet tanks. What the history books fail to mention is that half the horses veered away before contact, leaving their more obedient brethren to gallop pointlessly against armored steel. This moment perfectly encapsulated warfare's great transition, where machines now carried men into battle instead of the other way around, and where no living creature stood between human strategy and its consequences. Yet something curious happened as horses retreated from the battlefield. Their ghost lingered in military tradition, in terminology, in the subconscious tics of commanders who'd never ridden anything more temperamental than a jeep. The Pentagon's war room still had cavalry charges on their maps, marked by armored divisions instead of mounted lancers. Pilots spoke of horsepower as they climbed into cockpits. Generals unconsciously patted the sides of their staff cars like skittish mounts before important decisions. The vocabulary of horsemanship outlasted the horses themselves. Modern militaries developed elaborate systems to compensate for the loss of equine intuition. Early warning radar replaced horses' ability to sense distant vibrations through their hooves. Drones attempted to replicate a charger's uncanny knack for spotting ambushes. The entire field of battlefield psychology emerged to explain phenomena that stable hands had understood for millennia, like why soldiers and horses fought better on full stomachs, or why certain terrain just felt wrong. The shortcomings became apparent quickly. A tank couldn't refuse orders when sent into a minefield. A helicopter didn't nudge its pilot away from poor tactical choices. Most damningly, no machine ever developed that ineffable quality the old cavalry sergeants called horse sense, that preternatural awareness that told you when to charge, when to turn tail, when to push forward, and when to dig in. Modern technology provided more data, but less wisdom. Soldiers noticed first. Vietnam veterans spoke wistfully of how their grandfathers' horses would have detected Viet Cong tunnel entrances or smelled the copper tang of tripwires. Gulf War tank crews joked about wishing their Abrams could buck like a spooked mare when RPGs were incoming. The most telling moment came during urban combat training exercises, when drill instructors began unconsciously shouting, "Watch your mount's ears," to infantrymen, a phrase that made no sense unless you'd served alongside cavalry sometime in the past 2 centuries. Military academies scrambled to fill the gap. West Point added equestrian history courses that carefully avoided mentioning how often the horses had been right. Staff colleges developed complex algorithms to simulate what they called pre-modern battlefield intuition. Defense contractors patented tactical awareness systems that essentially tried to reverse engineer a horse's brain without acknowledging the source material. The results were mixed at best. No machine ever replicated Oberstab's knack for knowing which officers to ignore, or Tempe's ability to predict artillery barracks before they fired. Even military humor preserved the equine legacy. Soldiers still joked about getting a horse's opinion before major operations. The British Army's unofficial motto, "Horses for courses," endured long after anyone remembered it referred to matching cavalry mounts to terrain. A popular wargame cheat code that revealed enemy positions was known simply as the Marengo option, though few players understood the reference to Napoleon's prescient white charger. Perhaps the most poignant holdover appeared in leadership training. The old cavalry maxim, "Ride to the sound of the guns," became corporate seminar fodder, stripped of its original context. Management consultants preached equine-inspired leadership without realizing the irony. The best cavalry officers hadn't led their horses, they'd followed their horses' instincts. Modern generals studied Patton but missed his private writings about how often he deferred to his mount's judgment. Nowhere was this loss more apparent than in modern memorials. Warhorses appeared in bronze and stone, forever frozen mid-charge, their riders' faces set in heroic determination. No sculptor ever captured the more common battlefield reality. The horse planting its hooves while the officer yanked uselessly at the reins, the gelding turning its head to give that withering side eye that said, louder than any shout, "This is a terrible idea." As warfare grew more computerized, the ghost of horse sense grew more restless. Drone pilots reported dreaming of whinnies during long surveillance shifts. Special forces teams operating behind enemy lines described an eerie feeling of being ridden by some unseen presence. The few remaining ceremonial cavalry units became bizarrely popular among visiting staff officers who would linger at the stables with inexplicable nostalgia. In the end, the machines won. Tanks didn't disobey orders. Drones didn't question targets. AI systems didn't bite incompetent commanders. But somewhere in the Pentagon's deepest archives, if you know where to look, you can still find a fading after-action report from 1917 that says simply, "The horses knew first. We should have listened." It's filed under anomalies, right between unexplained phenomena and lessons learned too late. The final irony. Modern militaries now spend millions developing artificial intelligence to replicate what a $50 cavalry horse could do instinctively. The research papers never mention this, of course. But sometimes, late at night in lab corridors, engineers swear they hear the distant echo of hooves, and what sounds suspiciously like equine laughter. Chapter 20. Why Your Ancestor's Horse Deserved a Medal. History books overflow with the names of generals, men who commanded armies, delivered rousing speeches, and took credit for victories they often didn't earn. But if you trace the thin, hoof-marked margins of those same texts, you'll find the real architects of military success, the horses who carried, corrected, and occasionally rescued their riders from their own stupidity. Consider the mathematics of war. Bedtime understood. A cavalry charge required 2 minds, one to shout forward, and another to decide whether that was actually wise. The average horse made more tactical decisions per battle than most lieutenants did in a year, and with far better survival rates. While human officers debated maps and delayed over logistics, the horses were busy vetoing bad terrain, detecting ambushes, and, when absolutely necessary, depositing overzealous commanders into convenient ditches before they got everyone killed. Take the average Civil War cavalryman. He might have ridden into battle believing in glory, honor, and the righteousness of his cause. His horse, meanwhile, was operating on far more practical concerns. When that patch of ground looks muddy, those trees are too quiet. That officer's voice has the particular pitch of someone about to make a terrible mistake. While a soldier agonized over strategy, The horse was executing it, altering charge angles to avoid enfilading fire, slowing just enough to let stragglers catch up, or in extreme cases, abandoning the fight altogether when the situation became unsalvageable. The statistical evidence is damning. Battles where cavalry mounts were allowed some autonomy had significantly lower casualty rates. Regiments with a high number of stubborn or difficult horses, those most likely to resist suicidal orders, consistently outperformed those with perfectly obedient mounts. Even Napoleon, who famously said, "An army marches on its stomach," failed to acknowledge that it was usually the horses who decided where and when that march would stop. And yet, where are their medals? Where are the monuments to the Mare, who led a retreat that saved a battalion? Where is the citation for the gelding who nudged his rider behind cover seconds before a sniper's bullet struck? The Victoria Cross has been awarded for less. The Medal of Honor has been pinned on chests for far smaller services than, say, an entire cavalry charge being redirected because one sensible horse decided, no, not today. Even in retirement, these veterans were forgotten. While human officers wrote memoirs and collected pensions, the horses were sold off, put out to pasture, or worse, repurposed as glue by the very nations they'd served. The lucky ones became regimental mascots, trotted out on parade days like living relics. The rest faded into obscurity, their contributions reduced to footnotes like "A.K. Captain's mount unusually unruly that morning," as if recognizing an ambush before the scouts did was some kind of equine misconduct. Modern attempts to honor them have been feeble at best. A smattering of statues here, a children's book there, the occasional sentimental painting of a dying warhorse, meant to evoke pathos rather than the rightful outrage that no one had listened to it in the first place. Even today, when we praise war animals, we focus on their loyalty, their bravery, never their judgment. Because admitting that horses had better tactical sense than their riders would upend too many carefully constructed myths about human brilliance in war. So let us set the record straight. If your ancestor survived a cavalry charge, it wasn't just luck. It was likely because his horse had a better grasp of the battlefield. If a regiment miraculously avoided an ambush, credit probably belonged to a suspicious mare, not an omniscient colonel. And if some long-forgotten battle turned on a sudden, inexplicable shift in momentum, that was no accident of fate. That was a horse making a command decision. History may have erased them, but the proof lingers in the archives. The frustrated diary entries of officers whose mounts failed to cooperate. The after-action reports that vaguely reference unexpected delays before a disastrous engagement. The countless battles that Gelding have been slaughters, but weren't, for reasons no one could quite explain. The truth is simple. Your ancestor's horse deserved a medal. Not for carrying him into battle, but for so often refusing to. Not for following orders, but for knowing when to disobey them. And most of all, for being the only creature on the battlefield, with both the ability to save lives and the good sense to do so. We may never know their names, but we know their legacy. Every battle won against the odds, every disaster narrowly averted, every general outmaneuvered by the silent tactician between his knees. And if that's not worth a damned medal, nothing is.